All right, starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In this video, we're going to be going over the principles of modern training, how we willfully cause adaptation. So we're going to go over mostly the basics of programming and strength training, as well as we're going to talk about some energy systems and those types of things. And basically, how do we in the modern world create stimulus that causes adaptation and change? Because that's really what we're doing, is we're controlling stimulus to produce adaptation. So what is physiological adaptation? The functional definition is a set of ongoing types of intercellular, biomechanical, and metabolic adjustments inside an organism's body in order to maintain it in equilibrium under any kind of environmental condition. So that's kind of complicated. Let's break it down. First one, ongoing, continuously changing. The body is always adapting in one direction or another. It craves homeostasis, and it tries to achieve homeostasis by constantly changing. I know it probably sounds counterintuitive, but it seems to work biologically, so I'm not going to get into debating that point. So intracellular, located or occurring between cells. So it's about how cells interact. Biomechanical, related to the mechanical laws concerning the movement or structure of living organisms. It's important. This is an important one for what we'll be talking about from this point forward. When it talks about mechanical laws concerning the movement or structure of living organisms, that in particular is the important part, because I'll be talking a lot about the difference between correlation and causality. Metabolism, the chemical process that occurs within a living organism in order to maintain life. I like to think of metabolic function as essentially being a chemical furnace that results in thermic output. That's why we have body heat. So adjustment, a small alteration or movement made to achieve a desired fit, appearance, or result. In the context of this conversation, it's a metabolic adjustment, meaning that the metabolism is stimulated in such a way that the body then responds with some form of adaptation. An organism, the material or structure of an individual life form, or a whole with interdependent parts, likened to a living being. I think this is also important because if we think back to the evolutionary conversation, that's part of that independent, a whole with independent parts. How we responded to the world ultimately determined our structure. And when we look at our structure as an individual life form, it is even in a single lifetime still responding to the world. Equilibrium, a state of balance between opposing forces or actions that is either static, as in a body acted on by forces whose resultant is zero, or dynamic in a reversible chemical reaction where the velocities in both directions are equal. So whenever, in the case of, whenever we talk about dynamics for physical training, we're talking about multiple interacting systems that have some sort of desired result. Environmental condition, the quality or state of the environment are an inescapable part of daily life that can impact health. Environmental conditions such as water quality, air quality, and weather often vary among populations and geographic locations. So that's an example of the environment. Now, we also can control our environment in regards to the stimulus that we place on our bodies on a daily basis. This can be everything from the tonality of light throughout the day and into the evening. This can be the food that we eat. This can be the activities that we do. This can even be the people we surround ourselves with, or the information or stimulus that we take in. There is an implied relationship between stimulus and effect when it comes to talking about training and physiological adaptation. So the trick is, as the trainers, coaches, athletes, we have to understand that our job is to control stimulus. We have no control over the process itself, so we have to control the stimulus to initiate the process, and that's how we get the effect or desired adaptation that we're looking for. So first off, we're going to talk about something that is always talked about in regards to physical training, and that is progressive overload. So let's talk about progressive overload 101, the basics. Definition: progressive overload is a method of strength training and hypertrophy training that advocates for the gradual increase of the stress placed upon the musculoskeletal system and nervous system. So this is controlling some factor and increasing it over time, this, which we'll talk about. Factors to control. Resistance. So we can control how much resistance. An example of resistance would be, for example, how much weight you're lifting. That's an example of resistance. Tempo. How long does it take for you to control one contraction? That's tempo. So, for example, if it takes me 2 seconds to raise the weight and 2 seconds to lower the weight, that's a tempo. Volume. That's how much weight I lift over a given period of time. So say my workouts take 1 hour, and I total up the total number of weight I lifted within that hour. So that means, just as an example, if I'm doing a dumbbell curl at 10 pounds, and in a set I do 12 repetitions, that's 120 pounds worth of volume in that set. Leverage. In this case, leverage comes up a lot, particularly with body weight training, but also it comes up a lot with variable resistance and weight training. The leverage is all about, can I increase or decrease the amount of leverage I have to increase or decrease the amount of resistance I'm feeling? So, for example, a 5-pound weight held far out from your body it feels much more difficult to hold than if I hold that 5-pound weight very, very close to my body. Complexity, in this case, single joint, multi-joint, and possibly even multi-movement lifts like a clean and press increase in complexity. So if I start with a very simple isolated exercise and work my way up to a complex exercise, that is progressively changing the exercise's complexity, which ultimately equals progressive overload. Stability. If I go from a stable position to an unstable position, that is also controlling a factor for progressive overload. So, for example, let's say I start doing chest presses on an isolation machine. That's a high degree of stability. Then I move to a barbell bench press. That's a lower degree of stability. Then I move to a dumbbell bench press. That's an even lower degree of stability. So I may actually lift less and less weight, but get higher and higher recruitment as a result. And rest periods. I can increase or decrease my rest periods over time. So let's say I bench press 135 pounds 12 times. I take 3 minutes off and repeat that 3 times. Instead of increasing the weight, I can actually decrease the rest period to increase the metabolic stimulus over that period of time, as an example. And this all equals work capacity over time. So we can play with these numbers in an equational state that ultimately we can start measuring in how much work are you doing over time. A great example of this is when people go to kettlebell competition. The goal is to perform a certain number of clean and jerks or snatches over a certain period of time. at a consistent weight. That's a really good example of work capacity over time. And then frequency. How often do I do these exercises? So now we're not just talking about inside the workout itself, but we're talking about in the programming and periodization, how many times am I doing this in a day, week, month, year? So let's look at some standard barbell and dumbbell protocols for beginners and intermediates. Example A is going to be a basic hypertrophy protocol. So the goal here is not necessarily strength, but instead the growth of musculature. A beginner version of this would be 4 to 6 compound lifts in a workout, 3 to 6 sets for each lift, 8 to 12 repetitions per set, a tempo of 2-0-2-0. What that means is a concentric, that is contracting the muscle for 2 seconds for a single repetition all the way up, no pause at the top, and then a 2-second eccentric contraction. That means slowly lowering the weight for 2 seconds over the course of the repetition with no pause at the bottom, and then repeating that 8 to 12 times. That means that every repetition for 8 to 12 repetitions takes 4 seconds. The amount of time under tension for that is quite high. So you can imagine that this would result in an increased burning sensation, and this would be a high degree of metabolic stimulus for the particular muscle that we're utilizing. Rest periods of between 45 and 90 seconds, which is not a full rest period. And training each body part 1 to 2 times per week. This is kind of a standard bodybuilder modality. Example B would be strength and hypertrophy protocol. We're going to go back to something kind of resembling like a 5x5. So this is 4 to 8 lifts per workout. Remember, this is intermediate, so we're increasing the amount of volume in a single workout. So instead of it being 4 to 6, we could go as high as 8 lifts. And then now we're looking at 4 to 8 sets instead of 3 to 6. So again, we're increasing the overall volume. We're getting to a higher volume. 3 to 5 repetitions for big lifts. So we would put our big lift at the beginning of the workout. So say it's a powerlifting workout, but we're trying to get more hypertrophy to gain size. Maybe we're going to do a 5x5 of bench press. As you can see here, that would fit into this protocol perfectly. Then after we do that 5 sets of 5 heavy benches, we would switch to 6 to 8 reps for accessory lifts like dumbbell bench press, which we could then wind up doing 4 sets of that. Afterwards, we could do 8 to 12 repetitions of, let's say, deltoid raises and tricep pull downs to help with extension and lockout in our bench press. Tempoing 2-1-2-1. This means that we have a pause at the bottom and a pause at the top. And again, we're trying to control the weight throughout the full range of motion. And now we're looking at 60 to 120 seconds rest. Now understand that this is not a pure power protocol. If it were a pure power protocol, we would go as high as 3 minutes rest, possibly even 5, depending on how advanced the athlete is. Bigger lifts, more advanced volume, requires more rest so that they can get that volume in through lower rep range stimulus, where with this, it's more of a moderate range, 60 to 120 seconds. So if you're on the lower rep range side, you're probably going to, in a higher intensity and resistance side, you're going to take longer rest periods. And then again, we're talking about training each lift 1 to 2 times per week. Now notice that I've made a distinction in the second one between training the lift versus training the body part. And this is an important distinction. In powerlifting, you train toward the lift. In like functional power building, you train toward the lift, and then accessory work is toward body part. where when you're doing pure hypertrophy, you're training toward the body part. And there's an important distinction there. Like I just said, accessory work is based on performance of the lift and can change regularly. Back when I was training powerlifting and training people in powerlifting, we would look at where the lift itself struggled, and then we would build accessory work in the workout around that lift and where performance struggled. So now let's talk about periodization 101. Periodization is one way for the coach to approach the design of a resistance program. Periodization is defined as the planned manipulation of training variables, loads, sets, repetition in order to maximize training adaptations and to prevent the onset of overtraining syndrome. This is where cortisol shoots through the roof, testosterone drops, performance drops, and the person has to take a long break because their metabolic system has been, or nervous system have been overloaded. This also helps to avoid injury in the long term. Instead of just always trying to lift heavier, you want to go through phases of training in order to get the best stimulus, not only for the muscles, but for the nervous system, the ligaments, the tendons, and the bones, because they all have different recovery times that need to be accounted for with different intensity workloads and different stressors. They get different stresses for different outputs. They need different recovery times. So you want to make sure that you're doing a good job periodizing your training. So you have a preparatory period that's typically high volume, moderate resistance, heavy focus on form and tempoing to make sure that you're kind of laying a solid foundation to build on. From there, you get into your competitive phase. Now, understanding that a competitive phase is for people that are going to train to lift in competition, like Olympic lifters, kettlebell lifters, power lifters. This is also true for bodybuilders, but a bodybuilder during the competitive phase is focusing on trying to get as lean as possible while losing as little muscle as possible, where someone that's going into like a strength sport is also most likely trying to lean out, but not at the sacrifice of their maximal lifting capacity. So that's a difference. Now, from a functional perspective, there is really no competitive period. What we're doing is we're going from a foundational preparatory phase to a more high intensity phase, and then going into a more transitionary period, which is what we're going to talk about here. Transitionary periods are more moderate intensity again, moderate volume, focusing on recovery and as part of recovery mobility, where during the competitive phase, we're looking at a higher intensity, higher resistance, speed or power orientation, which you have to understand that speed and power orientation is hard on the nervous system, it's hard on the ligaments, and it's hard on the tendons, and it's hard on joint compression. So it's not, you can't lift like that consistently. The body will break down. So you have to move in and out of those high intensity phases with a certain degree of strategy. So now we're looking at, like, how do we look at these periods? So the quadrennial cycle is a multi-year plan, 1 to 4 years. It doesn't matter if you're talking about a fighter or a runner or a power lifter or even a bodybuilder. You have to kind of, as a coach or trainer, or if you're training yourself as an athlete, you have to be thinking in the long term. This will stop you from doing stupid things in the short term. You need to have a long plan. Your macro cycle's less than a year or a year, depending on whether or not you're an athlete that has on seasons. And then you have your mesocycles. These are 3 to 4 week cycles. They can go up to 12-week cycles depending on what you're doing. But typically your 12-week cycles, you're going to find, somewhere between the macro and mesocycle. So 3 to 4 week cycles are a really good way to control intensity. So like say I'm ratcheting up, I'm increasing my resistance over a period of time. Let's say I increase my resistance over 4 weeks. Then I'm going to change some variable, reset my position, and increase that resistance again over 4 weeks. This helps avoid overuse injuries. So let's say I do standard deadlift for 4 weeks, then I switch over to a sumo deadlift for 4 weeks, then I switch over to a straight leg deadlift for 4 weeks. Obviously, I'm going to get, for most people this is true, if I'm an intermediate to advanced lifter, my standard deadlift is going to be moderate. My sumo deadlift is going to be extremely high intensity because I can handle more load in a sumo position. And then in the straight leg position, it's going to be a lower load with a higher degree of leverage. So the muscles are getting adequate stimulus for fatigue throughout the whole process, but the spine and the joints are taking on different amounts of load. This helps us manage compression. And then we get into a microcycle that's 1 week. This is where we start looking at, okay, if we're doing conjugate method for powerlifting, for example, I'm going to do lower body on A day, upper body on B day, get my rest period. Then on C day, do lower body speed. Then on D day, do upper body speed. Then I'm probably going to either do recovery or complete rest for the last 2 days. And this is part of my microcycle. Conjugate method is an easy way to kind of break it up and talk about it. Where with bodybuilding, it's, you break it up by body part. So it's, chest on Monday, back on Tuesday, legs on Wednesday, arms and shoulders on Thursday. And then, you're essentially repeating that cycle, maybe not on a week, but on an 8-day cycle or a 10-day cycle or something like that. Just depends on how you program your work and whether or not you're going body part specific with isolation work or movement specific. And then obviously it comes down to the workout, and the workout is, based in hours or minutes, and obviously individual exercises. So metabolic stimulus, definition. Metabolic stress is the physiological process that occurs during the exercise in response to low energy that needs to metabolite accumulate. I'm not going to get into these specifics. Inside the muscle cells, traditional exercise protocol, i.e. resistance training, has an important impact on the increase of the metabolite accumulation, which influences hormone release. Hypoxia, that's a lack of oxygen, and reactive oxygen species, ROS, production in the cells, swelling. Changes in the acute exercise routine, such as intensity, volume, rest periods between sets, and determinants for the magnitude of the metabolic stress. So furthermore, the different types of training, such as low intensity resistance training plus blood flow restriction and high intensity interval training, could also be used to maximize metabolic stress during exercise. Basically, metabolic stress is the easiest one to affect. It's got the biggest shotgun spread. Basically, you do it till it burns. That's it. Or you do it to total fatigue. Or you do it until you just can't do it no more. And there's a lot of different ways to cause this. I'll be honest, in its most rudimentary form, CrossFit really knows how to do metabolic stress. They take their athletes in a single workout through almost all the energy profiles, all the energy systems in a single workout. So everything just gets absolutely slammed. And as a result, there's high metabolic stress. And as a result, as long as they recover properly, that's a really important caveat, there's a high degree of adaptation. If you have a high degree of metabolic stress, you also need a high degree of recovery. If you have a high degree of metabolic stress and you don't get appropriate recovery, you will get overtrained and you will likely get injured, or you will have the exact opposite effect of what you're looking for, and you will start to lose performance and muscle mass. That's why you have to really, really pay attention to which direction the numbers are going, because if they're going the wrong direction, you need to take a break because your metabolic systems are completely crashing. Anyway, the way that this works is you produce muscular tension in some form or another. Muscular damage occurs, and as a result, you get metabolic stimulus. Now, you can also get metabolic stimulus by, for example, inducing anaerobic respiration, which is what they're talking about when they're talking about high-intensity interval training, or using blood flow restriction to generate hypoxia without as much muscular tension and muscular damage. You get a higher degree of metabolic stimulus by cutting off that blood flow. That's why it works. This is also why it's a good idea to get into maximal heart rate during cardio after your workout, so that way you're getting the metabolic stimulus. You're sending the signal to the system that says, hey, give me some of that good stuff like human growth hormone or better testosterone production or just increased recovery because I've induced a high degree of metabolic stimulus. So neurological stimulus 101. This one's really important because all influenceable adaptations in the human body begin as a neural impulse. What that means is in order to produce a conscious adaptation, the first thing I have to do is think about it. And I mean, if I go to pick up something heavy, I have to do all that math in my brain first before my muscles even begin to contract. Or another way of looking at it is to influence adaptation means to control the environment in such a way that you influence the biology through neurological or biomechanical information received. Meaning, and this can be everything from temperature control, like doing Bikram yoga, to ice baths, to pressure massage. Like, there's just a million ways to influence stimulus. So, and when we start talking about the different lenses, I'm going to talk a lot about fascia. And you have to understand that, like, fascia, for example, is pressure sensitive. So I may not be able to contract my fascia consciously or even affect it consciously, but I can take a ball and I can roll on a ball, and the pressure on my skin and and that's going into the muscle can actually signal a fascial response or a circulatory response or a neurological response. I can use a percussion massage gun to increase blood flow to an area. I can do all kinds of different things from a stimuli level that's going to affect internal mechanisms in the body. That's what this little chart shows, is there's an input, some sort of stimuli for adaptation, then there's a coping mechanism or a regulator or a cognitor. These are, a regulatory response is like, for example, sending blood flow to an area, or a coping mechanism. Fascia, for example, reorganizes itself, those types of things. Then you have effectors. These are physiological functions, a self-concept, a role function, and interdependence. Basically, this is how the systems interact in order to produce some sort of adaptation. And that's why the arrow now goes to output. Adaptive and ineffective. Adaptive, these are positive, and ineffective, these are negative responses. For example, an adaptive positive response is growing muscle or getting stronger or having a higher degree of neurological control. An ineffective response would be overtraining, losing muscle, losing coordination, having a high heart rate, and having my energy systems drop out and bomb out because I'm overtraining and not recovering enough. And that's what the feedback is, and then we change our stimuli as a result. This is a trainer's job. Your job is to control this loop. That is your job. You manage this for your clients so they don't have to know what you know. You shorten the learning curve by being better at this than they are. and having the knowledge that is required to effectively set up and run these protocols and monitor their results and then make the changes that are necessary for them. And if you're very good at your job, you educate them in the process. So let's talk a little bit about energy systems and heart rate-based training. Heart rate-based training is a great way to know what energy system you're in. And we'll talk about that in a second. So there's a couple different ways you can monitor this. You can do it through technology. You can, like Orange Theory does this. They fit everybody with a heart rate monitor, and they aim for certain training zones. When we go back and talk about, the evolutionary model, the thermodynamic model, if you're in a low threshold, as you see here, you're in a very efficient state. If you're in one of these high thresholds, you're in a vastly inefficient state, but bridging into that vastly inefficient state can actually cause a higher level of adaptation that will then increase your lower threshold, if that makes sense. Basically, if you make the battery bigger by pushing the boundaries of the battery, you use less energy by percentage to do the easier things, even though the energy cost is still the same. It's another way of thinking about it. So a really simple way of knowing which of these you're in is, so let's say we're going for a walk, a jog, or a sprint. So if I'm walking, I can talk and it's comfortable. So I know whether I'm lifting or walking or playing or cleaning my house or whatever, I'm in this low threshold because I can hold a conversation. It's not a big deal. The benefit, you're going to get fit. Moving around is going to make you fitter. Your energy systems and biological systems are going to respond to that increased motion. Your wellness training, health. It's just good to move around. It's good to increase your circulation. It's just a positive thing. Your effort should feel somewhat low. And then when we get into the fuel burned here, you're going to notice that the orange color, you could call it orange, is the fat oxidation system. And the blue one is more what they call the glycolytic system or the carbohydrate system. So believe it or not, when you're exercising really easy and it feels easy and you're just moving around, this is also known as NEPA, non-exercise physical activity, you're actually burning more fat than you are carbohydrates. And so calories burned, some calories burned. Honestly, you burn the most calories by just being alive. So moving around is just a bonus, but you actually burn the vast majority of your calories just being alive. And then as far as this points system goes, we don't worry about it. Time in zones. So when we're talking about effective training, I would say that this should be your rest period. If we're talking about training in a workout. If we're talking about outside of the workout, well, you want to be living in this easy zone because it's efficient and overall it's just good for you. So next you have this moderate level. Moderate level would be like if we're on a jog, I can talk, but there's pauses to breathe and it's not entirely comfortable. You're going to get fitter. Your wellness zone, this is your fitness zone, meaning it's a generalized, it's not hyper-specific, it's generalized. That's what fitness means. It means it applies to all different kinds of things. Speed, power, flexibility, endurance, strength, all that stuff. Effort, modest. This is kind of where you want your weightlifting to be, I'd say, 60 to 80% of the time. You're going to get the best results if you are able to maintain a higher heart rate, but at a reasonable intensity level. Fuel burned, it's about equal here. Does it burn more calories? Yeah. Time in zone. This is really, you want to spend most of your time in a workout in this zone unless you're training for something very specific. But if your goal is just generalized fitness and wellness, this is the zone you want to be in. And then there's this vigorous level where you can barely talk. It's, this is like if you do a HIIT class, or you're doing intervals, or you're doing sprints, or you're doing a maximal lift. This is where you're going to burn the vast majority of carbohydrates. And the effort's going to be really, really hard. If you're doing this running, you're going to get fast. If you're doing it lifting, you're going to be developing power. Lots of calories get burned here, and if they don't get burned here, they need to be consumed in order to recover. And your time in this zone is going to be short. So if we're talking about like maximal lifts, we're talking 1 to 3, maybe 1 to 5 repetitions. If we're talking about running, we're talking about probably no more than a minute output. Like this is, you're gonna bridge into your high heart rate threshold fairly quickly here. So when we're looking at energy systems, we're looking at what's doing what at different stages in the game here. So your ATP system is, it's the phosphogenic system. It's the reason people take creatine phosphate, is so that you can get more energy into that phosphogenic system. This lasts for about 0 to 6 seconds. So when people say, well, weight training is anaerobic. Yeah, it is to a degree. But when you're talking maximal lifting, it's not even anaerobic. It's like phosphogenic. Like, maximal lift, say you're doing a 1 rep max, you're in this area, extremely high intensity. Or you're doing a very short sprint. If you're jumping great distances, if you're throwing something, if you're suddenly in a wrestling match and you're in a clinch and you guys are in a struggle for position, you're immediately in this zone. Next is the phosphogenic and fast glycosis. This means that your body's using some carbohydrates and some of that ATP system. This is about 6 to 30 seconds. So say you're on a sprint, and for the beginning of that sprint, you're going to be using these 2 energy systems, as long as it's less than 30 seconds. If that sprint lasts longer, you'll notice, like say you take off and run as fast as you humanly can, you'll notice that you're real quick in those first 6 seconds, and then after 30 seconds go by, you start gasping for air and slowing down because your body is shifting energy systems. Now we're going into glycosis, fast glycosis. 30 seconds to 2 minutes. This is where your body's burning mostly carbohydrates. So you're not burning in this zone fat, actually. But stimulating this region will increase your overall metabolism for recovery, which means when you're recovering, your metabolism will be higher and you'll be more likely burning more fat because you're in that oxidative zone in the lower heart rate zone, if this all makes sense. Anyway, then you're into fast glycolysis and oxidative systems, 2 to 3 minutes. So if you can sustain an activity for 2 to 3 minutes, that's kind of where you're at. If you're able to consistently sustain the activity for 3 minutes or longer, you're in the oxidative system, basically. So this could be walking is 100% in the oxidative system. This is also where your body transitions to when you're in rest periods. So your body bounces between these energy systems a lot. And it's really important to understand that a really good workout should stimulate all of them in one form or another. So now we ask the question, do you want to be a specialist or a generalist? So in the specialist department, you have a high level performers. We're talking about people, 1,000-pound squat. That's a specialist. Chances are if you're pushing a 1,000-pound squat, you're not running a marathon. They just require very different energy systems and very different types of athleticism. They're equally challenging. very difficult. They all require an enormous amount of discipline and years of training, but they're just very different. So when you get into the competitive range for these things, um, you know, you start to hyper specialize into bodybuilding, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, running, and other skill-based activities. So even martial artists or gymnasts or dancers are very specialized in their needs. So there's pros to this. You can outperform the average person in a specific field multiple times over. You will absolutely destroy a generalist if you are in your wheelhouse. Your weight to performance ratio tends to be incredibly high. This means your relative strength. So pound for pound, Bruce Lee was one of the most powerful athletes of his day, arguably, because he was very light, but what he could output was nuts. And you're capable of elite level performance here. The cons: you have a high risk of overtraining. You have a high risk of long-term damage to joints, ligaments, and bones. You have a high risk of injury, and you do lose a general capacity for movement. And when you suddenly stop being a specialist, you may suffer for it because your body has developed a very specific equilibrium of strengths and weaknesses. And if that strength suddenly goes away, the weaknesses don't go away. You have to train those out. Or you can be a generalist. This is a moderate level of performance of many activities. The base level of fitness is solid in all areas. High level performance is unlikely in the long term. So you might be able to, kind of do better here and there. CrossFit tries to push the boundaries of being a generalist. And this is also why it's kind of the best and worst of both worlds. But not to rag on CrossFit, but they do something really unique outside of the other areas. And so it's important to understand that really the peak level of generalist performance, you could say, you could see in CrossFit. That's why I didn't list it as a specialist field. So pros: quickly able to adapt to changing conditions and outperform in a dynamic environment. And what I mean by a dynamic environment, and I hate to use this as an example, would be battlefield stress. You don't want to be hyper specialized in a battlefield scenario. You don't want to be hyper specialized in everyday life. You just don't want to be. If you were suddenly thrust into a survival situation, you would be much better off being a high-level generalist than a high-level specialist. Health benefits from all fields. So you get the health benefits of being able to run. You get the health benefits of having muscle mass. You get the health benefits of being strong. You get the health benefits of having better mobility. You get all those benefits because you practice with all of those things in mind. And you have a lower risk of injury as a result because there's a synergistic effect between these different systems. The cons are you're not going to be competitive compared to a specialist. A specialist is going to absolutely blow you out of the water. You have a lower weight to performance ratio in specific fields, but your overall capacity, let's say you're training for a triathlon, if we focus it in triathlon, well, then, we can start measuring weight to performance ratio in that specific field. If we're talking CrossFit, in that specific field. If we're talking boxing, in that specific field. But you're not likely going to maintain an elite level performance long term. You have to pick a side. You're either going to be a specialist or a generalist, and if your goal is health, well-being, and longevity, then you're going to want to be a generalist. If your goal is to compete, then you have to be a specialist. If you are going from being a specialist, meaning you were once a competitor and you need to move into the health and wellness area because you're aging, then you need to know how to transition from being a specialist to being a generalist effectively. And you also need to know how to do this for your clients. And you also need to know how to program for the different aspects for them based on whatever their goals are. So health and longevity. So I stole this. It talks about longevity experts and their workouts routine and their workout routines compared. These guys are all fairly famous. You probably recognize their faces. But as you see here, these are the fields that they look at for health and longevity. Moderate intensity cardio. This is where we're talking about like long rucks, zone 2 cardio. It's called zone 2 cardio. High intensity cardio. This is interval training, strength training, and then flexibility or yoga training. These are basically the 4 factors that we're looking at. So important factors outside of those things are balance. A really good test of this is, can you put your shoe on without putting your foot down? So say I want to put my right shoe on, the very first step would be picking up my right foot, and then without putting my right foot down, reaching down, picking up my shoe, putting it on my right foot, and then putting my right foot on the ground. That's a great test of balance. Grip strength. Can you hang from a bar for 30 seconds? Relative grip strength test. Really, really simple. Mobility. Can you get up off the ground without using your hands? This is a huge marker of longevity. For a lot of this stuff, I'll be putting links in the description below, but this is this has been isolated as one of the most important skills that you can possibly have. Heart rate. How often do you get 120 minutes of zone 2 cardio a week? Zone 2 cardio is not that intense. Or how often do you get 60 minutes of zone 3 or 4 cardio per week? These are those upper zones. Zone 2 is like the high level of like low. Zone 3 is that moderate area. Zone 4 is that peak level area. And zone 5 is maximum output. And what is your resting heart rate? If your resting heart rate is below 60, you're probably doing pretty good. If your resting heart rate is above 60, that is cause for concern. There you go. And visceral and body fat. What is your visceral fat and body fat percentage at? Now, believe it or not, being in single digits isn't entirely healthy. And being over a certain number isn't entirely healthy. So I know BMI is one way of looking at it, but looking at your visceral and overall body fat is probably a much better marker of your overall health and wellness than BMI, because BMI does not account for lean muscle mass, where visceral fat and overall body fat get right down to the mechanisms of things that cause type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and other major issues. Do you even know your body fat? Do you know your visceral fat? So the takeaways from this entire video are the key to reaching your goals. Knowing what your goals are, that's going to be a big deal. It's going to ultimately determine your programming. Are you training for specialist, or are you training for health and wellness and longevity? Understanding how to best train to reach those goals, which we've talked about. Any single thing I've covered in this video, you can literally become a specialist in as a trainer or athlete. Like, you can dive into any one of these topics and go well beyond where I'm at. I'm just giving a broad overview of the different factors that we need to be mindful of and control when it comes to training. Being consistent on that path. So knowing how to periodize your programming and making sure that it's set up in a way where consistency is possible. Having a long-term view over a short-term view. So like I said, if you're thinking about it properly, you should be thinking in 1 to 4 years, not 12-week programs or 30-day challenges. You should if you take your training seriously, you need to be thinking in the long term. Mastering the basics and building from there. So understanding what are the important fields that we need to be covering, what basic numbers do we need to hit, where are the numbers for whatever our goals are that tell us, okay, this means we're performing adequately and properly. For health and well-being, we know it's grip strength. We know it's resting heart rate. We know it's mobility and coordination and balance. We know that it's, overall body fat composition and lean muscle composition. We know that those are the things that lead to longer life and better quality of life. Notice that none of those are a six-pack, and none of those are a max squat, and none of those are a max deadlift. It's about training multiple modalities. Like I said, fitness and wellness is a skill and a practice, not an inherent quality that is improved over a lifetime. Okay, this isn't a new year, new me situation. This isn't a 12-week program situation. This is evaluating long-term concepts, and instead of jumping from one activity to another, training in a mindful and meaningful way that helps us cover all of these fields with as little risk to ourselves as possible or to our clients as possible. So thank you for sitting through this video and all the others. I hope this has been helpful. If you have questions or feedback, or there's a topic you'd like to know more about, please leave it in the comments section below, because it helps me have a conversation with you about where we can go and how we can isolate these factors to create better training for ourselves and for our clients.